He showed up at her gate in the dead of winter with nothing but an axe, a bedroll, and a look in his eyes that said he'd already survived things most men wouldn't survive talking about. She had 2 starving children inside, a ranch falling apart board by board, and a debt she couldn't pay with everything she owned combined. She should have turned him away. She didn't. And what happened next on that frozen frontier would force an entire valley to ask itself one brutal question. How far would you go to save a stranger's family when saving your own is already impossible? Stay with me until the very end. This one will stay with you. If stories like this speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Boone Callahan found the Whitlock place, the temperature had already dropped far enough to split fence posts down the middle. He'd been following the old trail south from the high country for 3 days, moving at the pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and too many things weighing on his mind to move faster. The mountains behind him were swallowed in gray cloud. The plains ahead stretched flat and colorless toward a sky the color of dirty dishwater. And somewhere between those 2 miseries, half hidden behind a cluster of bare cottonwoods and what used to be a proper wooden gate, sat the most defeated-looking ranch he'd seen in 15 years of wandering the frontier. He stopped walking. He didn't know why exactly. He'd passed struggling homesteads before. God knew there were enough of them out here. But something about this particular patch of broken-down earth made him set down his pack and look longer than he should have. The gate had collapsed on one hinge and been propped back up with a piece of rope someone had tied in a hurry. 3 fence rails lay in the snow where the wind had knocked them. The barn roof sagged on the left side like a man favoring a bad shoulder. The windmill, the one thing every ranch out here needed to stay alive through winter, sat frozen and motionless. One of its blades snapped clean off. There was smoke coming from the chimney of the main house, but thin smoke. The kind that meant whoever was feeding that fire was being very careful about how much wood they used. Boone picked up his pack. He walked to the gate. He knocked on the post because there was nothing else to knock on. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door of the house opened 4 inches, and a woman's voice came through the gap, steady and flat, the way voices got when fear had been going on long enough to wear itself down into something quieter. "Whatever you're selling, I can't afford it." "Not selling anything," Boone said. Another silence. "Then what do you want?" "I don't want anything, ma'am. I was just passing through and I noticed your windmill's got a broken blade. Figured I'd mention it in case you hadn't seen." The door didn't open any further. "I've seen it." "All right." He nodded at the roof of the barn. "Your barn's going to lose that left section before the next heavy snow. Weight's sitting wrong." "I know." "Okay." He shifted the weight of his pack. 3 of your fence rails are down on the south side. Cattle'll wander before morning if you've got any left." There was a pause that was slightly different from the others. "Why are you telling me this?" Boone considered the question. It was a fair one. He thought about his answer for a moment, not because he was trying to come up with the right thing to say, but because the honest answer was one he wasn't entirely sure how to explain. "Because it needed saying," he finally told her, "and because I can fix it." The door opened. Oh, her name was Mara Whitlock, and she was not what Boone expected, though he wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. She was maybe 32, possibly younger, with the kind of face that had once been pretty in a soft way before the weather and the work and whatever else had happened to her got to it first. Her hair was dark and pulled back with no particular care. She was wearing a man's coat over her dress, her husband's coat, Boone guessed, from the way it hung on her, and she was holding a rifle that she wasn't pointing at him but wasn't not pointing at him either. Behind her, 2 children stared through the doorway. A boy of maybe 9, serious-faced, standing slightly in front of a girl who looked to be 6 or 7. The girl had her fingers twisted into the back of her brother's shirt. "You're alone?" Mara said. "Yes, ma'am." "Where'd you come from?" "North. Up past the Harrow Ridge country." She studied him for a moment with the particular thoroughness of a woman who'd learned to make quick judgments and live by them. Whatever she saw in him must have landed somewhere acceptable, because she lowered the rifle slightly. "I've got almost nothing to feed you," she said. It wasn't an apology, it was just a fact she was laying on the table before anything else was decided. I didn't ask to be fed. Then what did you ask for? I asked to fix your windmill. Her expression didn't change much, but something shifted behind her eyes. Men don't fix things for other people's ranches without wanting something in return. No, Boone agreed. They don't usually. So what do you want? He thought about it again. That honest answer he was still feeling his way toward. In his pack he had dried venison and hardtack and a small amount of oats that he'd rationed carefully, enough for himself for another few weeks. He also had the furs, the pelts he'd been stacking up for going on 3 years now, rolled tight and stored in oilcloth in his pack. Those furs were going to buy him something important. He hadn't come down from the mountains to give them away, but there was a girl with her fingers twisted into her brother's shirt, and the brother's coat was too small, and neither of them looked like they'd eaten enough that morning. I've got children of my own, Boone said, which was something he hadn't said out loud in a while, and the saying of it felt strange in his mouth. They're not here right now. They're far away. And someone helped them when I couldn't. He paused. I'm still trying to work out how to pay that back. Mara looked at him for a long time. You want milk, she said finally. Ma'am? That's what you're going to say? You want milk for your children, or something along those lines. That's always what they want when they're pretending not to want anything. Boone almost smiled. I don't need milk. But if you've got a cow that's giving, your kids should be drinking it. The silence that followed that was a different kind of quiet. Harder. There's a cow, the boy said from the doorway. She's giving, but not much. Eli, Mara said quietly, and the boy went still. How much is not much? Boone asked. The boy, Eli, looked at his mother. She gave a small nod. Maybe half a pail a day, he said. Used to be more. Boone set his pack down in the snow. He crouched next to it and opened the top flap and pulled out a small paper-wrapped package of oats. He held it up. You mix a handful of these into her feed morning and evening for 4 days, she'll double her production. Maybe more. He held the package out to the boy. Go ahead. Eli looked at his mother again. Mara stared at Boone for another long moment. Then she said, Eli, take it. Tets. He started with the windmill. Not because it was the most important thing, the barn roof was more urgent in terms of structural danger, but because fixing the windmill meant the water trough wouldn't freeze solid overnight, which meant the animals wouldn't go thirsty, which meant everything else on the property stood a better chance of making it through the week. Boone thought in sequences like that. He always had. Figure out what failing first causes the next thing to fail, and start there. He got the broken blade off by early afternoon and spent 2 hours in the barn fashioning a replacement from a piece of old lumber he found under a pile of rotting harness. Mara came out twice to watch and said nothing both times. Eli came out once and stood in the cold for 40 minutes watching Boone's hands work, the way boys did when they were trying to learn something without admitting they were trying to learn it. What's your name? The boy asked eventually. Boone. Just Boone? Boone Callahan. We're Whitlocks, Eli said, as if Boone might not have figured that out. I'm Eli. My sister's Clara. She doesn't talk much to strangers. That's fine. She used to talk more. He paused. Before. Boone kept working. Before what? Eli didn't answer right away. Our pa died, he said, in that flat, careful way kids used when they'd said a hard thing so many times it had worn smooth. About 8 months ago, horse threw him out near the east pasture. By the time Mama found him, he stopped. It was too late. I'm sorry, Boone said, because there wasn't anything else to say to that. Mama tries not to let us see how scared she is, Eli said. But I know, I can tell. He kicked at a piece of ice with the toe of his boot. Are you going to try to take our ranch? Boone looked up from the wood he was shaping. What? Mr. Mercer says we owe him money, and if we can't pay, he's taking the ranch. He came out 3 times already. Last time he brought a man from the bank. Eli's jaw was set in a way that made him look older than 9. Mama told him to get off our property. He laughed. Boone looked at the boy for a moment. Who's Mercer? He owns most of the land around here. Pretty much everything except us. Eli's voice carried a careful kind of contempt that he'd clearly learned from his mother. He says we borrowed money from the bank and we owe interest. Mama says we borrowed a lot less than he claims. What does the bank say? The bank man does what Mr. Mercer tells him. Eli said it like it was just a fact, something he'd understood the way children understood unfair things, completely, without any hope that understanding it would change it. When's the windmill going to be fixed? Boone let the subject turn with him. Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds. Can I help? You know how to use a hand plane? No. You will by tonight. For the first time since Boone had arrived, something on Eli's face relaxed just slightly. Not a smile, not quite, but something. Yet, dinner that night was thin. A bean soup that Mara stretched with water and a hard biscuit each. The kind that had been sitting a day too long and you had to be careful not to crack a tooth on. Boone ate his without comment. He'd eaten worse. Clara sat across from him and didn't say a word the entire meal, but by the end of it she'd stopped watching him with that particular expression of children who are afraid of what a new person might mean for their lives. You don't have to stay, Mara said, after the children had gone to bed. She was washing the bowls in a basin of water that wasn't quite warm enough. You fixed the windmill. I'm grateful. You can move on in the morning. The barn roof will come down in the next snow, Boone said. He was sitting near the stove with a mug of coffee so weak it was basically hot water with opinions. Take me 2 days to brace it properly. I didn't ask you to fix my barn. No, ma'am. So why would you? He turned the mug in his hands. Because you need it done. Mara put down the bowl she was washing. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was tired and suspicious, and something else underneath, something she was clearly working hard to keep from showing. What is it you actually want, Mr. Callahan? Because I've been out here long enough to know nobody does something for nothing. I told you, I've got children somewhere that someone helped. That's not an answer. That's a reason. It's not the same thing. He looked at her. No, he said quietly. I suppose it isn't. She waited. I want to know they're okay, he said after a moment. My kids, they're with their aunt out in Missouri. I've been sending what I can, but the furs I've got, they're supposed to be enough to go get them. Bring them back out here. He looked at the mug. I just want to know that I can still build something worth bringing them back to. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind moved across the plains with that low particular moan it got in deepest winter. By fixing my windmill, Mara said slowly. It's a start. She stared at him for another moment. Then she picked up the next bowl and went back to washing. The barn roof, she said. Then you move on. Yes, ma'am. She didn't say anything after that, but she didn't tell him to sleep in the barn either. She put a blanket on the floor near the stove and left it there without comment, and Boone understood that was as close to welcome as the Whitlock Ranch had offered anyone in a long time. He lay down in the dark and listened to the wind, and thought about his children, and thought about what a man named Mercer, who laughed at a widow woman, might be capable of once he realized that the dying ranch at the edge of his land was starting, slowly, improbably, to breathe again. He thought about that for a while. Then he closed his eyes and slept. The barn roof took 3 days, not 2. Boone had said 2, and he'd meant it when he said it, but the third morning he got up onto the roof and pulled back the first section of compromised timber, and found the damage went further than he'd seen from the ground. Rot had gotten into the main support beam on the left side. Not just surface rot, but the deep structural kind that had been spreading quietly for probably 2 winters while no one had the time or money or energy to look for it. The kind of rot that waits. He spent most of that first day on the roof in the cold, pulling off boards and assessing what could be saved and what couldn't was more than he'd hoped. Mara stood below him for a while with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, watching the pile of discarded timber grow. How bad? She called up. Bad enough, he said, but fixable. With what lumber? I've got maybe a dozen usable boards in the whole property. I saw a stand of straight timber about a mile east along the creek bed. Dead trees, dry all the way through. Better than green cut for this kind of work. That's Mercer's tree line. Boone looked down at her. Is it posted? Everything around here is Mercer's something, she said flatly. Whether it's posted or not depends on whether he's thought about it lately. I'll take my chances. She started to say something else, then stopped. He could see her working something out. The math of pride versus necessity, which was the calculation that defined life on the frontier more than any other. Take Eli, she said finally. He knows where the good wood is. The boy was ready before Boone had even finished lacing his boots. He was standing by the door with an axe that was slightly too big for him and an expression of complete readiness, the way children were when they'd been waiting for someone to give them something useful to do. They walked east in the gray morning light without talking much. The snow was crusted on top and broke through underfoot with every step, which made the going slow and loud. Boone liked Eli's silences. The boy wasn't quiet because he was shy. He was quiet because he was paying attention, which was a different thing entirely and considerably rarer. You know how to fall a tree? Boone asked after they'd been walking a while. I've watched Pa do it. Watching's the first half. I know that. They found the timber stand where Boone had estimated it, a dozen dead cottonwoods along the frozen creek bank, their gray trunks bone dry and straight, exactly what was needed. Boone walked the line of them with his hand against the bark, testing. This one first, he said, stopping at a tree about 18 inches across. See how it's leaning east? You want the tree going with its lean, not against it. Against it's when people get hurt. He looked at the boy. You understand why? Eli studied the tree. Because if you cut against the lean, the tree can pinch the axe, or fall the wrong way. That's right. Boone handed him the larger of his two axes. You're going to make the notch cut. I'll finish it. Don't go more than a third of the way through on the face cut. Stop when I tell you. What followed was slow and full of corrections, and one moment where Eli's stroke went wide and chipped bark in the wrong place, and he went red in the face and muttered something angry under his breath that he clearly hoped Boone hadn't heard. Boone had heard it. Say it louder next time, he said, without looking up from where he was examining the notch. Cursing when you miss is better than pretending you didn't. Eli blinked. Mama says cursing is... Your mama's right, but we're not home. Boone took the axe back. Hold your left shoulder higher on the downswing. You're dropping it and losing power. By the time they had 3 trees down and sectioned, the sun was already past its low winter peak and starting to drop. They hauled the logs back on a wooden sled Boone had found behind the barn and repaired the night before with a length of rope and 2 pieces of bent iron he had straightened out against the stove. It was slow work, and neither of them mentioned how heavy it was. On the second trip back, Eli said, Do your kids know how to do this stuff? Fall trees and like that? Not yet, Boone said. They're young still. How old? My boy's 7. Girl just turned 5. Eli was quiet for a moment, pulling hard at the sled rope. What are their names? Boone's jaw shifted slightly. Cade and Rosie. Where are they? Missouri, with their aunt. Do they know you're coming back? Boone didn't answer right away. The sled scraped over a patch of ice, and they both adjusted their grip without needing to say anything. They know, he said. The barn roof took shape over the next 2 days. Mara worked alongside Boone for most of it, not hovering, not watching, but actually working. She hauled timber, held boards in place while he hammered, and climbed the roof herself to nail down the far edge of the new section when Boone's reach didn't extend that far without someone steadying the beam below. She was not afraid of heights, and she was not afraid of work, and those 2 things told Boone more about her than anything she'd said. Claire came out on the second afternoon and sat on an overturned bucket near the barn door, bundled up in a coat with the collar pulled up to her ears, watching. She had a rag doll in her lap that she wasn't paying any attention to. She was watching Boone's hands. He came down off the roof to get more nails and found her there. Hey, he said. She looked up at him, said nothing. He crouched down to her level, which he'd found usually helped with small children who weren't ready to talk. He picked up a short piece of scrap wood from the ground and a nail from the tin at his belt, and without any setup or explanation, he drove the nail straight through the board with 2 clean strokes of the hammer. Clara watched. He pulled the nail out, held the board and the nail out to her. She looked at them, then at him. Then she took them. "You have to hold the nail at the bottom," he said. "First stroke just sets it. Don't swing hard or it goes crooked." She set the nail against the wood. Her first swing was too cautious and the nail fell over. "Again," he said simply. Her second try set it. Her third stroke bent it. She made a small sound of frustration that wasn't quite a word but communicated the feeling clearly enough. "Pull it out and try with a fresh one," Boone said. By the 4th nail she had the motion. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't powerful, but it was correct. And she looked up at him with something that took him a moment to identify because it had been a while since he'd seen it directed at him. Pure, uncomplicated pride. "There you go," he said. When Mara came down off the roof 20 minutes later and found Clara still working her way through the nail tin, driving nails into a scrapboard with focused intensity, she stopped and looked at Boone. He just picked up the next plank. The fences were next. The south pasture fence had 6 sections down and 2 more that were 1 wind away from joining them. The posts were rotted at the soil line, which was the chronic problem with fence posts in this kind of ground. Winter wet and summer dry, which was about the worst combination you could ask for. Boone cut new posts from the remaining timber, charred the bottom foot of each one in the fire barrel to seal the wood against moisture, and drove them into the frozen ground with a post maul that he had to thaw out first because the striking face had iced over. He taught Eli how to set a post level using nothing but his eye and the horizon and a plumb line made from a piece of string and a nut from the equipment box in the barn. The boy took to it. He was the kind of kid who, once he understood the logic of something, stopped needing to be told. On the 4th morning, working alone on the east fence line, Boone heard hooves on the trail road. He kept working. The hooves stopped somewhere behind him. He could hear multiple horses, 3, maybe 4, and the particular quality of their stillness that meant their riders were watching him. "That's Whitlock land you're working on," a voice said. It was a voice accustomed to not being questioned, deep, well-fed, carrying the specific kind of ease that came from owning enough of something that other people's anxiety was a source of entertainment rather than concern. Boone drove the fence rail into its notch, checked the level. "I know," he said. "And who might you be?" He turned around then, because there was no point pretending the conversation wasn't happening. 3 riders. The one in the center, on a very large gray horse, was the one who'd spoken. Big man, maybe 55, wearing a coat that had been expensive 5 years ago and was still the nicest coat within 20 miles. His face was broad and weathered, but not from working cut, from riding and watching other people work, which put lines in a different pattern. He had the kind of confident stillness that Boone associated with men who'd gotten used to walking into rooms and having the rooms rearrange themselves. Gideon Mercer. Boone hadn't needed Eli to describe him to recognize him. "Boone Callahan," he said. "Never heard of you." "That's fine." Mercer looked at the fence line, then at Boone, with an expression that was working to be pleasant and not quite making it. "I wasn't aware Mrs. Whitlock had hired herself a ranch hand. She didn't hire me." "Then what are you doing on her property, Mr. Callahan?" "Working." Mercer's jaw moved slightly. One of the riders behind him, a lean man with a thin beard and flat eyes, shifted in his saddle. The shift wasn't accidental. It was the kind of shift men made when they wanted you to notice they were there. "I have a financial interest in this property," Mercer said. "I like to know who's coming and going." "I imagine you do," Boone said. The pleasantness in Mercer's expression didn't disappear exactly. It relocated, moved somewhere behind his eyes where it became something else. "Mrs. Whitlock owes a significant debt to the Harrow Creek Bank. The terms of that debt include certain provisions about property improvements requiring creditor approval." Boone looked at him. "That's so." "It is. Which means the work you're doing," he gestured at the fence, "may technically be in violation of her loan agreement." "I'd read that agreement carefully before you said that to a lawyer," Boone said. "I'm not a lawyer, but even I know that a creditor can't prevent a property owner from maintaining their own land, especially when the alternative is the property losing value." Mercer's eyes went slightly colder. "You know something about law, do you, mountain man?" I know something about what sounds like a bluff, Boone said, which is different. The silence that followed had weight in it. Mercer sat his horse and looked at Boone with the expression of a man recalibrating, not retreating, not yet, but taking a longer measure of what he was dealing with. That windmill was broken for months, he said finally, almost pleasantly. Now it's not. The barn roof looked like it was coming down last week. Now I see new lumber up there. He looked at the fence line again. Somebody's putting a lot of work into a ranch that's about to change hands. I wouldn't be too sure about that last part, Boone said. Mercer looked at him for another long moment. Then he pulled his horse's head around. Tell Mrs. Whitlock that the bank will be expecting its payment in full by the 1st of February, interest included. He paused without turning back. That gives her 3 weeks. He rode away. The lean man with the flat eyes was the last to turn his horse, and he stayed a moment longer than he needed to, looking at Boone with an expression that wasn't threatening exactly. It was assessing. The way a man looked at something he expected to be dealing with again under worse circumstances. Boone picked up his post-maul and went back to work. He told Mara that evening. He thought about not telling her, but she needed to know the timeline, and she deserved to make her own decisions with the full picture in front of her rather than whatever partial picture he chose to give her. She was quiet while he talked. She stood by the stove stirring something in a pot that didn't need stirring, which was the thing hands did when the mind was working on something difficult. 3 weeks, she said when he'd finished. That's what he said. He's been saying different deadlines for 4 months. The banker changes the date every time he comes out. She stopped stirring, but this time felt different. It is different, Boone said. He's seen the ranch improving. That changes his math. She turned to look at him. How? Because when a property looks like it's dying, he can wait. Walk in eventually and pick it up for almost nothing. But if it's recovering, if it looks like you might actually make it, he either has to move now or lose the opportunity. Boone sat down at the kitchen table. He'll come with the banker and legal papers this time, not just threats. Mara set the spoon down. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, and Boone could see her running numbers behind her eyes. The kind of numbers that never quite added up, no matter how many times you ran them. How much do you owe? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. More than the place is worth right now, she said. Daniel, my husband, he took the loan out the spring before he died. We were going to expand, add a second herd, push into the north pasture. She looked at the floor. He had plans, good ones, actually. He was a good planner. A short pause. Just not with horses. Boone didn't say anything to that. The interest is the thing, she said. The original amount we could maybe manage. Mercer's man at the bank has been adding on at a rate that doesn't match what's in the paperwork. I've said so. Nobody listens. You have the paperwork? I have Daniel's copy. I don't know how much good it does. It might do more good than you think. You need someone to look at it. She gave him a look that wasn't quite bitter, but was close. The nearest lawyer is 40 miles. I can't leave the ranch for 2 days with the children here, and I can't take them in this weather, and I can't afford a lawyer anyway, so. So, Boone agreed. The fire worked quietly in the stove. Outside the wind was picking up again, that signature prairie wind that didn't howl dramatically like mountain wind did. It just pressed, steady and relentless, like something trying to get through the wall by persistence alone. Why are you still here? Mara asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. He considered the question. The fences aren't done, he said. Boone. The equipment in the barn needs sorting. Half of it's rusted and the other half's in the wrong place. And the root cellar door is warped, which means you're losing heat every time you open it. That's not what I'm asking. I know, he said. She looked at him steadily. She had the kind of eyes that didn't let you give half answers and feel like you'd said something. I came down from the mountains for a reason, he said slowly. I've been up there 3 years doing the one thing I know how to do, which is trap, and saving everything I made, and I had a number in my head, an amount that was enough to go get my children and come back here and build something that wasn't just me alone in a cabin. He looked at his hands. And then I walked past your gate, and the windmill wasn't turning, and I thought, okay, one more week, one more thing to fix before I go. One more week was, she counted backward, 8 days ago. I know. Boone. I know, he said again. The small silence between them had a different quality than the ones before, less guarded. Your children must miss you, she said. I miss them more, he said simply. Eli's voice came from the back of the house, calling for his mother about something that turned out to be nothing urgent. Mara straightened up and called back that she'd be there in a minute. She picked up the spoon again, then she set it down. The equipment in the barn, she said. I sorted it twice. It never stays sorted. It will if the shelving's in the right place, which it isn't. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Fine. The shelving. He nodded. He reorganized the barn over the next 2 days. It was quieter work than the roof or the fences, less physical, more methodical, and it gave him time to think, which wasn't always a comfortable thing, but was necessary. He thought about Mercer and the timeline. He thought about the loan papers Mara had in the house and what they might say. He thought about the number he'd been carrying in his head for 3 years and what subtracting from it would mean. He didn't make any decisions yet. He just let the thinking happen. Clara found him in the barn on the second afternoon. She had her rag doll under one arm and a nail in her free hand. One of the nails from the scrap session the other day, which she'd apparently kept. She held it out to him. He accepted it with appropriate seriousness, as if it were a coin of some value, and slipped it into his nail tin. She watched him sort a collection of old tools. A draw knife, 2 spokes halves, a hand brace with 3 bits, all of them needing cleaning and sharpening. These belong to your papa? He asked. She nodded. He kept good tools, Boone said, which was true. Under the rust they were quality made, well balanced. A man's character showed up in what he kept and how he kept it, and the tools told Boone that Daniel Whitlock had been serious about his work even when things had gotten hard. Clara sat down on an overturned bucket, the same one she'd used outside. It seemed to be her chosen bucket. She watched him work the rust off a blade with an oiled rag, slow and careful. Are you going to leave? She asked. It was the first complete sentence he'd heard from her. Her voice was small and careful, the way voices were when they'd been kept quiet for a while and weren't entirely sure what would happen if they came out. Boone kept his hands moving on the blade. Not today, he said, but sometime. Sometime, he said. He looked at her. But not before the work's done. She seemed to accept that. She hugged her doll and watched him work, and neither of them said anything else, and that was fine. The snow started again on the 11th day. Not the slow testing snow of the early storms, but real snow, the kind the prairie threw at you in January when it meant business. Thick and sideways and carrying a wind that dropped the temperature fast enough you could feel the change happening against your face. By mid-morning, visibility was down to 50 yards and falling. Boone moved the 2 remaining cattle into the barn. He'd repaired the stalls 2 days earlier specifically against this possibility, and now the beasts moved into the dry space with the urgency of animals that understood weather better than most people. He made sure the water trough was full before it could freeze over and packed the barn door gaps with the rope and sacking insulation he'd assembled from the materials in the equipment loft. Mara came out into the storm to help. She arrived at the barn door with ice already in her hair and 2 extra blankets under her arm without being asked, because she'd already looked at the animals and made the same calculation he had. They worked side by side in the warm animal smell of the barn, not talking much, both of them doing what needed to be done. It was the kind of work that happened in a rhythm when 2 people had been around each other long enough that they could anticipate each other's movements without planning it. Boone noticed it and didn't say anything about it. When the animals were settled and the barn was as tight as it was going to get, they stood just inside the door listening to the storm work itself against the walls. Outside, the world had become a white moving thing with no edges. "This'll last 2 days," Mara said. "At least." She was looking out at the yard, which was disappearing. The windmill was turning now, catching the storm wind doing its job. "You did good work on that," she said, without any particular inflection. "It's a decent windmill," he said. "Somebody built it well to begin with." "Daniel built it," she said. "I figured." She was quiet for a moment. He was better with a wrench than he was with a rope. Always was. He built that windmill in 4 days. Never done it before. Just figured it out. She paused. The horse was... He wasn't afraid of them exactly. He just didn't respect them the way you have to. Another pause, shorter. I told him that. More than once. People hear what they can hear, Boone said. That's a kind way to put it. I'm not trying to be kind. It's just true. She glanced at him sideways. Are you ever wrong? Constantly, he said, without hesitation, and that surprised a small sound out of her that was the closest thing to a laugh he'd heard from her since he'd arrived. Not a full laugh, more like the beginning of one that stopped itself. But it was there. The storm pushed hard against the barn wall. Somewhere above them, the new roof held without complaint. 3 weeks had become 2. And somewhere in a house 40 miles away, Boone was almost certain, Gideon Mercer was sitting warm in front of a large fire, watching the snow come down and thinking about timing. The storm broke on the second night and left behind a silence so complete it had weight. Boone was up before first light, the way he always was, and he stood in the doorway of the barn in the dark and looked at the world the blizzard had remade. Everything was buried. The fence lines were invisible. The trail road had disappeared entirely under 4 feet of drifted white. The cottonwoods along the creek stood glazed and motionless, their branches carrying more snow than seemed reasonable, and the sky above them was the particular clear black that only came after a big storm had wrung itself out completely. He should have felt the cold. He barely noticed it. He was thinking about Mercer. 2 weeks. That was what was left on the deadline Mercer had named, and Boone understood enough about men like that to know the storm wouldn't extend it. If anything, the storm would accelerate things. A man who wanted a property couldn't afford to wait for spring. Spring meant planting season, and planting season meant a working ranch had value again. Mercer would move before the ground thawed, maybe well before. Boone went back inside and started the morning fire and tried to think about something practical. He couldn't. He'd been carrying the furs in his pack so long that the weight of them had stopped registering as separate from himself. 3 years of trapping, beaver, mink, otter, and 6 fox pelts that had come out so clean and thick they'd made even him stop and hold them up to the light for a moment before rolling them into the oilcloth. He'd built the collection slowly, deliberately, the way a man built anything when he knew exactly what it was for. Each pelt was a dollar amount in his mind, a calculation he could run in his sleep. The total was enough, barely enough, and only if he got to the right buyer in the right city, but enough. Enough to go to Missouri and bring Cade and Rosie home. He knew what he was considering. He'd been circling it for 3 days, the way you circled something you didn't want to look at directly. Approaching from angles, retreating, coming back. Telling himself he was just thinking. Telling himself he hadn't decided anything. He'd decided something. He just hadn't admitted it out loud yet. Mara came into the kitchen before Eli and Clara were awake, which happened sometimes on mornings after hard weather. She moved quietly, the way people did when they were used to being the first one up and didn't want to break the particular piece of a house still sleeping. She saw Boone at the table with his coffee, and she didn't say anything, just went to the stove and added wood and put a pan on for whatever she was going to make for breakfast. "I need to ask you something," Boone said. She didn't turn around. "Ask." "The loan papers, the ones Daniel signed. Can I see them?" Now she turned. She looked at him with the careful expression she used when she was trying to figure out what was behind a question before she answered it. "Why?" "Because I want to understand exactly what Mercer's claiming versus what's actually in writing. I've read them myself, multiple times." "I know. I'd like to read them too." She studied him for a moment. Then she went to the back room and came back with a folded set of papers that had been read so many times the creases were beginning to separate. She put them on the table in front of him. He read slowly. He was not a lawyer, and he knew it, but he'd read enough contracts in his life. Fur trade agreements, land surveying documents, the papers he'd signed when he'd tried and failed to establish a proper homestead before his wife got sick, to understand what he was looking at. What he found in the papers was worse than he'd expected in some ways, and better in others. The original loan amount was substantial but not impossible. It was the interest structure that was the problem. a compound arrangement that the banker had apparently been applying at a rate higher than what was written in the original terms. Not dramatically higher, just enough higher that over 4 months it had inflated the total owed by nearly a third. Done quietly. Done with numbers that required careful reading to catch. Done with the confidence of a man who knew the person on the other side of the desk either couldn't read well enough to notice or was too desperate to make an issue of it. Daniel Whitlock had noticed. There was a margin note in pencil on the 3rd page, in tight, careful handwriting. This rate doesn't match Clause 4. Check with someone who knows contracts. He'd seen it. He just hadn't lived long enough to do anything about it. Boone sat with the papers for a long time. "The rate he's been charging you is wrong," he said. Mara put down the pan she was holding. "I know that. I mean, legally wrong. Clause 4 specifies a fixed rate for the first year. What the bank's been calculating is compounded monthly. That's not what you agreed to." "I know that too." Her voice was steady but had an edge in it that was directed somewhere other than at him. "The banker's name is Aldous Crane. He's been in Mercer's pocket since before Daniel ever walked into that office. Knowing the rate is wrong and being able to do something about it are not the same thing." "No," Boone said. "They're not." He folded the papers along their worn creases and set them back down. "If the debt was calculated correctly," he said, "what would you actually owe?" Mara was quiet for a moment. She'd done this math before, he could tell. She'd done it in the middle of the night, probably, the way people did with numbers that wouldn't leave them alone. "Somewhere around $480, she said. "Maybe a little less." "And what's Crane telling you that you owe?" $640. Boone said nothing for a moment. "The furs I have," he said carefully, "are worth somewhere between $700 and $800 at a trading post in a city with real buyers. Less out here. A lot less." Mara went very still. "Boone," she said. Her voice had changed, lower and more careful, the way people's voices went when they understood exactly what was being said and weren't sure they wanted to let it keep being said. "Don't. I'm just telling you what the furs are worth. I know what you're telling me." "Then you know it's a solution." "It's not a solution. It's—" She stopped. She pressed the heel of her hand against the edge of the counter, a short, controlled gesture that was the outward sign of something she was working hard to keep contained. "Those furs are your children. You know that. You know that's what they are." "They're pelts," he said. "I can get more pelts." "In another 3 years. Maybe 2. "Boone." She said his name like it was the end of an argument, like she was trying to close a door. "I'm not going to let you give up your children for my debt. That's not— I won't do that. I won't." "You don't have to do anything. It would be my decision. That's the same thing." He looked at her. She was not crying, and she was not going to cry. He'd understood that about her from early on, that she'd reached some point in the last 8 months where she'd moved past the kind of grief that expressed itself in tears and into something harder and less visible. But her eyes were very bright, and her jaw was set, and her hand was pressed flat against the counter like she was trying to keep the room from moving. "Let me ask you something," he said. "No." "You haven't heard the question." "I know what the question is, and the answer is no." "If the situation was reversed," he said, "what would you do?" The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird called once in the cold, an absurd sound in January, and then went silent. Mara looked at him for a long time. The brightness in her eyes didn't go away, but something in her expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. She didn't answer him. She turned back to the stove. Mutt. They didn't talk about the furs again that day, or the next. The days that followed the storm were filled with the exhausting work of digging out, clearing paths, checking fence lines for new damage under the snowdrifts, breaking ice in the water trough twice a day, managing the animals. The work was good. Work that needed doing was its own kind of relief when the alternative was sitting still with difficult thoughts. Eli threw himself into it with the focused energy of a boy who'd recently discovered that effort had tangible results, which was the kind of discovery that changed how a person moved through the world. He was stronger than he'd been 2 weeks ago, not in any dramatic visible way, but in the small adjustments of posture and the way he picked up a tool, the absence of the uncertainty that had been in his hands when Boone first arrived. Clara had developed a habit of bringing Boone a cup of water at some point in the middle of each afternoon, appearing at his elbow without any announcement, waiting until he registered her presence, accepting his thanks with a small, serious nod, and disappearing again. It was her version of a contribution, and she executed it with complete consistency, and Boone found he'd begun timing the later part of his afternoon work with an awareness of when she'd likely appear. He didn't examine that awareness too closely. It led somewhere he wasn't ready to look. Mercer came on a Tuesday, 11 days before February. Boone was splitting firewood in the yard when he heard the horses on the trail road, and he set down the splitting maul and waited, because he'd been half expecting this moment for more than a week, and there was no point doing anything else until he saw what it looked like. It looked like 4 horses. Mercer on the gray, the lean man with the flat eyes, whose name Boone had since learned was Dex, and who functioned as Mercer's personal warning that things were about to get physical, and 2 other riders Boone hadn't seen before, both of them wearing the expressions of men hired to stand in the background and make the foreground feel more serious. Behind them, in a small one-horse buggy that had no business being on a trail road in these conditions, sat Aldous Crane. Boone had never met the banker, but he recognized the type immediately. Crane was a small man, soft in the way that had nothing to do with fat and everything to do with the absence of any experience that had ever required him to push back against physical reality. He was holding a leather satchel across his lap with both hands, and he had the look of a man who was uncomfortable being in a place where he couldn't call for someone else to handle whatever went wrong. Mara had come out onto the porch. She'd heard the horses, too. She was standing with her arms at her sides. Not the rifle stance, not yet, just standing. And her face had gone to the particular blank it went to when she was marshaling herself. Mercer stopped his horse in the yard. He looked at Boone, then at Mara, then at the barn roof and the fixed fence line, and the turning windmill with an expression that moved through several emotions too quickly to catch individually, landing finally on something controlled and thin. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. Polite tone, social tone, the worst kind. "Mr. Mercer." She matched it exactly. "I wasn't expecting company," Mercer said, nodding toward Boone, "to still be here." "Mr. Callahan has been doing repair work," Mara said. "So I see." Mercer dismounted with the ease of a large man who'd spent his whole life on horses. He handed his reins to Dex without looking at him. "The property's looking considerably better than last time I came through." He said it conversationally, but there was something underneath it. Not quite anger, not yet, more like the flat front of a weather system with worse behind it. "Which makes this harder. I won't pretend otherwise." "Makes what harder?" Mara said, though she knew. Crane climbed down from the buggy. He opened his satchel and produced a set of papers that he carried toward the porch, with the particular officiousness of a man performing a procedure he'd performed many times before and had made his peace with. "As of today," Mercer said, "the outstanding balance on the Whitlock property loan stands at $642.30. The Harrow Creek Bank has extended every possible consideration to your family and has concluded that the debt can no longer be deferred. These papers authorize transfer of property title in satisfaction of the outstanding obligation." Mara didn't take the papers Crane was holding out. "The outstanding balance, as written in my husband's loan agreement," she said, "is considerably less than what you're quoting. The interest rate you've been applying isn't what's in Clause 4 of that document." Something flickered in Crane's expression, quickly suppressed. Mercer's expression didn't change at all, which was more telling than if it had. "The rate is standard for the risk category of the loan," he said. The bank has the legal authority to apply the rate that was agreed to in writing," Boone said. He'd walked closer to the porch without quite deciding to. "Not a different one." Mercer looked at him. The pleasantness was gone now entirely, not even attempted. "I'd stay out of this if I were you, Callahan." "I've read the loan papers," Boone said. "Clause 4 is pretty clear. The rate Crane's been calculating doesn't match. You run the correct numbers. The Whitlocks owe closer to $480. Crane's jaw tightened. "The bank's calculations are wrong," Boone said simply, "which a lawyer 40 miles from here could establish in about an afternoon. I'd imagine a judge would find it interesting, too." The word judge did something small but visible to Crane. His fingers moved on the papers. Mercer was quiet for a moment. He was a man accustomed to maneuvering, and Boone could see him doing it, identifying the positions, measuring the ground, calculating. The angle he came back with was smoother than Boone expected. Let's say, hypothetically, the amount owed is $480, Mercer said. His voice was almost generous, which was the most dangerous register it had been in. Does Mrs. Whitlock have $480? The silence that followed that question had a specific quality. Mara's jaw was set. She said nothing. Because a legal argument about interest rates, Mercer continued, takes time. Lawyers cost money. Courts are in session twice a year in this district. And in the meantime, the debt is still owed. The legal papers I've just had delivered are still valid under current bank authority. And I can pay it, Boone said. Everyone looked at him. Mara said, Boone, not now, he said quietly to her. Then to Mercer. Give me 2 hours. Mercer studied him. 2 hours. That's what I said. And what exactly are you proposing to pay with, Mountain Man? That's my business, Boone said. 2 hours. Your banker can wait at the Harrow Creek office. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. The calculation was visible. Weigh the risk of waiting against the certainty of taking the property now, with a man standing in the yard who'd read the loan documents and used the word judge, and clearly wasn't going to make this easy. Sometimes waiting costs less than forcing. 2 hours, Mercer said. He remounted with the economy of motion of a man trying to make leaving look like a tactical choice rather than a retreat. He looked at Mara. If Mr. Callahan doesn't produce payment by that time, Mrs. Whitlock, I'll expect your cooperation in the transfer. He looked at Boone one more time, the flat, assessing look, and rode out. Dex went last again, the same way he had before. This time his look at Boone was not assessing. It had moved past that into something more specific and less abstract. Mara waited until the sound of the horses was gone before she turned to Boone. When she did, her voice was quiet and direct in a way that made the quiet worse. Don't do this. Go inside, he said. I need to get my pack. Boone, look at me. He stopped. He looked at her. She was standing 3 feet from him in the winter yard with her breath coming in small clouds and her eyes doing what they'd done the morning in the kitchen, that brightness that wasn't tears but was related to them, the thing underneath them. You told me, she said, that every fur in that pack is Cade and Rosie. You said that. I said they're pelts. You said Cade and Rosie. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. I did. Then how can you? Because I can trap again, he said, and his voice was level, but something in it wasn't, some edge that she heard because she was paying the kind of attention to him that he hadn't fully registered she'd started paying. I can go back up the mountain, and I can start over. I've done it before. I know how to do it. He paused. But I don't know how to watch a family lose their home when I'm standing right here and there's something in my pack that stops it. Mara looked at him for so long that he almost said something else. She turned and went inside. He went to the barn and got his pack. The furs were rolled in the oilcloth the way he'd packed them 18 months ago when they'd reached the number that meant something, and he unrolled them on the barn floor in the gray winter light and looked at them for a moment. The mink were the best. 8 pelts, full winter thickness, the color of dark water. The beaver were bulk and value, 14 of them, each one representing a set of particular mornings he could remember. Specific weather, specific water, specific silences. The fox were the ones that got him. He'd spent 3 weeks on those 6. He'd done everything right, the sets and the lures and the timing, and they'd come out perfect, which was the kind of thing that only happened when you'd been doing something long enough that your luck and your skill had started to merge and you couldn't tell them apart. He rolled them back up. He didn't let himself look at them for longer than he needed to. He picked up the pack and walked out of the barn. Eli was standing in the yard. He'd been watching, or listening. The barn door hadn't been closed. His face was doing something complicated that he wasn't able to fully control, which meant he'd heard enough of what had been said in the yard to understand the shape of it. You're giving them your furs, he said. Yep. All of them? Yep. Eli was quiet for a moment. What about Cade and Rosie? Boone stopped walking. He looked at the boy who was looking back at him with that 9-year-old seriousness that cut through things adults had learned to route around. I'll figure that out, Boone said, but they'll have to wait longer. They've waited this long. He said it more steadily than he felt it. They can wait a little more. Eli's jaw did the thing it did when he was working hard to match his face to something he'd decided. He looked at his boots. Then he looked up. It's not fair, he said. No, Boone agreed. It isn't. You shouldn't have to do this. Probably not. The boy's eyes were very bright. He blinked once, hard, which was clearly all he was going to permit in that direction. Okay, he said, which meant something much larger than okay. Boone put a hand on his shoulder briefly. Then he walked to the house. He found Crane at the Harrow Creek Bank office 40 minutes later. The banker had beaten him there, which meant Mercer had sent him ahead. A small power gesture, making Boone cool his heels in the cold outside before Crane's assistant opened the door. Boone was not a man who cooled easily, and the cold barely registered. Inside, Crane sat behind his desk with the papers already arranged in front of him and the particular expression of a man who had done something he wasn't proud of for long enough that he'd stopped noticing it. Boone set the rolled furs on the desk without ceremony. Crane looked at them. Something moved across his face that was almost difficult to watch, a kind of recognition. A man who dealt in the language of money, seeing the exact value of what was in front of him before he could prevent himself from seeing it, and then understanding what it meant. Open them, Boone said. Crane unrolled the oilcloth. The furs spread across the desk and over the edge, and some of them fell onto the floor, and he picked them up with hands that were not quite steady. He examined them. He took his time because the kind of man Crane was could not help taking his time when the kind of quality in front of him was this obvious. These are exceptional, Crane said quietly, almost to himself. I know what they are, Boone said. I also know what they're worth. I'm prepared to sell them to satisfy the Whitlock debt at the correct amount as specified in Clause 4 of the loan agreement. Not your inflated figure. The correct one. He looked at Crane steadily. In exchange, you'll give me a receipt marked paid in full and a signed acknowledgement that the lien on the Whitlock property is discharged. Today. Crane looked at the furs for another moment. Then he looked at Boone. Mercer won't... He started. This is a bank transaction, Boone said, not Mercer's transaction. You're a banker, Mr. Crane. You know the difference between what's legal and what Mercer tells you to do. I'd think carefully about which one you want in writing. The word writing landed the same way Judge had in the yard. Crane looked at the furs for a long time. Then he reached for his pen. Boone walked back to the Whitlock Ranch in the late afternoon light with a receipt in his coat pocket and an empty oilcloth rolled under his arm. The sky was going orange and purple in the west, that brief winter color that lasted maybe 20 minutes before the dark came and canceled it. The trail road was quiet. The fields on either side were white and unmarked. He was not sorry. He checked for sorry the way you checked a wound, not to make it worse, just to know what was there. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something closer to tired. Not the physical tired of work, which was clean. The other kind. He turned in at the gate that stood straight now, the rope hinge replaced with real iron hardware he'd salvaged from the equipment box, and walked across the yard to the house. Mara opened the door before he reached the porch. She'd been watching from the window, probably. She looked at his face and then at the empty oilcloth under his arm, and she understood immediately. She pressed one hand briefly against the door frame. Just a moment, just one breath. Come inside, she said quietly. Supper's ready. He went up the steps. Claire appeared at Mara's side and looked up at Boone with serious eyes. She raised her arms in the gesture that very small children used and very few adults acknowledged as what it was, a direct statement, the most honest one available. Boone bent down and picked her up without thinking about it, and she put one arm around his neck and pointed importantly at the kitchen, indicating that supper was a matter of some urgency. Yeah, Boone said into her hair. I know. He carried her inside. Eli was already at the table, and he looked up when Boone came in, and whatever was on his face was something Boone was going to remember for a long time. Not gratitude exactly, which could feel like debt, but something steadier than that. Recognition. The look one person gave another when they'd stopped being a stranger and become something else, something that didn't have a clean word for it in any language he knew. The door closed behind them. Outside, Gideon Mercer's name was still on half the land in the valley, and his anger was going to be substantial, and nothing about the future was certain or easy or promised. But tonight the debt was paid. Tonight the Whitlock Ranch was still the Whitlock Ranch. And in the kitchen, 4 people who had not known each other 3 weeks ago sat down to a meal that none of them made any particular fuss about, because some things didn't need fuss. Some things were enough, just as they were. Word traveled the way it always did out on the plains, not through newspapers or telegraph wire, but through the specific human current of people who had reason to be moving from one place to another and stopped long enough at the next place to say what they'd seen. The man who started it was Aldous Crane, which surprised everyone who heard it later, including Crane himself. He hadn't intended to tell anyone. He'd sat in his office after Boone left and looked at the furs spread across his desk for a long time. Longer than was professional, longer than was necessary. And when his assistant came in to ask if he needed anything before closing, Crane had looked up and said, somewhat involuntarily, "A mountain man just laid his entire life's savings on this desk to pay a widow's debt, every pelt he owned." And then he'd stopped, as if hearing himself say it had made it more real than the furs themselves had. His assistant, a young man of about 22 named Percy, who was still young enough for things to land on him the way they were supposed to, had gone home that evening and told his mother, who told her neighbor, who happened to be married to one of the freight drivers who ran supplies between Harrow Creek and the settlement at Caldwell Crossing. By the end of the week, the story had covered 40 miles in 3 directions. It didn't travel cleanly. Stories never did out here. Some versions got the details wrong. The amount of the debt, the number of furs, the nature of Mercer's involvement. One version apparently had Boone pulling a rifle, which had not happened and was not the kind of thing he would do. But the core of it stayed true across every telling. A stranger had given up 3 years of his life's work to save a family he'd known for less than a month. And the family was a widow with 2 children and a ranch that had been on the edge of dying. People heard that, and they felt it in the specific place where frontier people kept the things they never talked about. The bone-deep knowledge of how close any of them were, at any given time, to the same edge. Ma'am. The first visitor came 4 days after the bank transaction. Boone was working on the root cellar door, the warped one he'd mentioned to Mara weeks ago and hadn't gotten to yet, when he heard a wagon on the trail road. He straightened up and watched it come. It was a farm wagon, the working kind, loaded with something covered by a canvas tarp. The man driving it was broad and red-faced, with a dark beard starting to go gray at the edges, and he had a woman beside him who was smaller and sat very straight. They pulled up at the gate, and the man climbed down without any particular preamble and walked to where Boone was standing. "You Callahan?" he said. "I am." The man stuck out his hand. "Walt Greer. I run the spread about 6 miles northeast, past the Hendry Road." He shook Boone's hand once, firmly, let go. "This is my wife, Ruth." Ruth Greer nodded from the wagon seat with the specific nod of a woman who had decided something and was watching to make sure it was executed correctly. "Heard what you did," Walt said. He said it without any elaborate framing, the way people on the frontier stated facts. "For the Whitlock family." "It's not something I need discussed," Boone said. "No, but it's something that needed doing, apparently, and you did it." Walt turned and pulled the canvas off the wagon without ceremony. Underneath was a dressed hog carcass, 2 sacks of grain, a crate of preserved vegetables, and a smaller box that turned out, when Ruth later carried it inside, to contain 6 jars of put-up tomatoes and a crock of lard. "Winter stores," Walt said. "We had extra this year, first time in a while." He said the last part without emotion, but with a kind of weight that made clear it hadn't always been so, and that he remembered what it was to not have extra. Mara had come out onto the porch by then. She looked at the wagon and at Walt Greer, and her expression went through several things in quick succession. Discomfort, something close to embarrassment, then a more complicated thing that took longer to resolve. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I can't accept—" "Mrs. Whitlock," Ruth said from the wagon seat, with the voice of a woman who had anticipated this response and prepared for it. "We're not asking. We're delivering. She looked at Mara steadily. I lost my first husband. 12 years ago, different territory, same situation. Someone brought a ham to my door that winter and I ate it, and I'm still here. She paused. That's all this is. The silence that followed that had a particular texture. Mara looked at Ruth Greer for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in a voice that was very quiet and entirely sincere, which was different from the polite thank you she might have produced otherwise. Walt Greer looked at Boone. "You're going to need help getting that north fence line rebuilt before spring," he said. "I've got 2 strong boys who aren't doing anything useful. I'll send them over." He said it in the same tone he'd said everything else, not offering exactly, more like scheduling. Boone started to say something. "Don't argue," Walt said. He climbed back onto the wagon. "Ruth doesn't like it when I'm late for supper and we've still got the drive back." They left the same way they'd arrived, without ceremony. But the second visitors came 2 days later. These were 3 men from Caldwell Crossing, a blacksmith named Orrin Fitch, who had arms like bridge supports and spoke in short, complete sentences, a trapper called Eddie Marsh, who was about 60 and had a laugh that was completely out of proportion to the rest of him, and a younger man named Sullivan, who didn't explain his first name or his business, and who helped unload what they'd brought without being asked. What they'd brought was timber, good timber, straight cut and seasoned, the kind that cost real money, 2 full wagon loads of it. "For the outbuildings," Orrin said, when Boone came out to see what the noise was. "Heard your equipment shed's half rotted, and the south-facing lean-to on the barn needs rebuilding. My nephew came through your way last fall and mentioned it." "I didn't know your nephew," Boone said. "He mentioned you anyway." Orrin looked at the barn with a professional eye. "I can take a look at that lean-to today if you want. Won't take long to get a sense of it." Eddie Marsh was already walking the property with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at everything with the assessing eye of a man who spent his life making do with what the land offered. He stopped at the windmill and stood looking up at it. "New blade," he said, to no one in particular. "From last month," Boone said. "Good pitch on it." He kept looking. "You set that yourself?" "Yes." Eddie turned and looked at Boone with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Marsh, Eddie Marsh. I trapped the Coldwater drainage, north side. Heard you came down from the Harrow Ridge country." "That's right." "Good beaver country up there. I worked the south side 5 years back." He paused. "Heard you gave up your whole pack." "I'd rather it not be a topic of conversation," Boone said. "Already is," Eddie said, not unkindly. "You don't get to decide that part." He looked back at the windmill. "Man puts that kind of thing on the table, people are going to talk. That's just how it goes." Boone said nothing to that. "What I wanted to say," Eddie continued, "is that the Coldwater North Side's producing, has been for 2 winters. I'm getting too old to work the whole line, and my partner moved on last spring." He glanced at Boone. "If you needed to rebuild your pack faster than working alone, there's a line up there worth sharing. I'm not handing you charity. I'm telling you it makes business sense to have a reliable partner on the north section." Boone looked at him. "Why?" he said. "Because I'm 61 and my knees are bad and I don't like the north section in January," Eddie said. "I just told you why." "That's the practical reason," Boone said. "What's the actual reason?" Eddie was quiet for a moment. He looked at the windmill again. "I've got a daughter," he said. "She's got children. Her husband left 3 years ago, and I don't know where he is and I don't care where he is either." He paused. "Somebody should have done what you did for her. Nobody did." He started walking toward the barn. "So when I hear about somebody doing it for somebody else, I figure the least I can do is make it easier for that somebody to get back on his feet." He went into the barn to look at the lean-to. Boone stood in the yard for a moment. Sullivan was still unloading timber, working steadily without any apparent need for conversation or acknowledgement. The stack of good wood beside the barn was already 3 feet high. He picked up the other end of a plank and helped. Mara watched all of this from a complicated distance. It wasn't that she was ungrateful. She was grateful in a way that was almost structural, something that had changed the way she moved through the rooms of her own house, the way she stood at the window in the morning, But gratitude was not a simple feeling for a woman who'd spent 8 months being the one who held everything together through sheer stubbornness and refusal to ask for anything. Receiving was its own kind of work, and she hadn't practiced it. One evening, after Eli and Clara were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table across from Boone and said, "I don't know how to do this." He was sharpening a knife, the slow, careful kind of sharpening that was more about thinking than the blade. Do what? Let people help. She had her hands wrapped around a mug. I've been out here 8 months. My nearest neighbor is the Greers, and I've spoken to them maybe 4 times. I didn't ask for anything because I didn't want— She stopped. I didn't want anyone to think we couldn't manage. You were managing, Boone said. Barely. That's still managing. She looked at him. You know what I mean. I know what you mean. He drew the blade slowly across the stone. Pride's not a bad thing. Out here especially, it keeps you moving when the math doesn't work and the weather's against you, and there's no particular reason to think tomorrow's going to be different from today. Pride's what you run on when you're out of everything else. He paused. But you can run on it too long. Start to think it's the only fuel. She was quiet for a moment. Daniel was like that, she said. He would have stood in a burning barn before he asked a neighbor for a bucket. She said it without bitterness, just the clear-eyed thing that happens sometimes. The way you could see a person's whole self more completely once they were gone, and you'd had time to understand them without needing anything from the understanding. I loved that about him. I was also furious at him for it constantly. Sounds about right, Boone said. She almost smiled, not quite. You're like that too. Am I? You gave up 3 years of your life for my debt, and you told me not to make it a topic of conversation. Those are different things. Are they? He set the knife down on the table. He looked at it rather than at her. The furs were mine to use, he said. I made the decision. I'd make it again. He paused. Asking for help is different. Asking for help means admitting you can't do something alone. And you can do everything alone. No. He said it without any particular defense. I can't. I've been doing it alone for 3 years, and I can tell you with confidence it doesn't work as well as advertised. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the winter air pressed against the walls in its steady way. The marshman, Mara said. The older trapper. What did he say to you? This afternoon, in the barn. He offered me a trapping partnership on the Coldwater North line. She looked at him. That's good country. So he said, Are you going to take it? Boone picked up the knife again, turned it in his hands without sharpening it. It would cut the time in half. To rebuild what I used. He paused. Maybe less than half. Mara was quiet for a moment. Kate and Rosie, she said. Yeah. She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. Tell me about them. He looked up. She met his gaze steadily, and there was no angle in it. No attempt to lead the conversation somewhere. No tactical kindness. She was just asking because she wanted to know. He wasn't sure how long it had been since someone had asked him that who actually wanted the answer. Cade looks like his mother, he said slowly. Same coloring. Same way of being quiet when he's deciding something. He was 4 when I left, and he already had that thing. You know when someone's got a conscience that works too hard? Already had it at 4. He paused. Rosie's different. She came out arguing and hasn't stopped. She's the one that's going to walk into a room someday, and everyone in it is going to wonder why they didn't notice she was the most important person there. He stopped. Their mother, Mara said carefully, died of fever 2.5 years ago. He said it the way he'd learned to say it, directly, like pulling something out rather than letting it be pulled. 3 weeks after Rosie's 3rd birthday. I wasn't there. A pause, the shorter, harder kind. I was up the mountain. I didn't know she was that sick. By the time I got back down, he stopped again. My wife's sister took the children. She's a good woman, Margaret. She didn't have to do it, and she did it. I've been trying to earn my way back to them. The kitchen was very quiet. You're a good father, Mara said. Not warmly, not as comfort, just as an observation, the kind that registered as true precisely because there was no softening around it. I'm an absent one, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him. You left them so you could come back better than you were. That's different from leaving. A pause. Not everyone knows the difference. He looked at her. She looked back. There was something in the air between them that had been building for a while, in the way that things built when you were too busy surviving to look directly at them. Slow and cumulative and harder to ignore now that the immediate crisis had passed and the room was quiet and there was nothing urgent to do with your hands. Neither of them said anything about it, which was, in its own way, a kind of acknowledgement. Oh, Orrin Fitch came back with 2 helpers the following Saturday, and they rebuilt the lean-to in a day and a half. It went up crooked at first, a miscalculation in the angle of the main post, and they had to pull the first section and reset it, which nobody mentioned afterward, in the way that working men didn't mention mistakes that had been corrected. The result was solid. Better than the original, which had been thrown up fast by someone who knew carpentry well enough to get by, and no better. Walt Greer's 2 sons arrived on a Monday. They were 16 and 18, large and somewhat awkward with the largeness, still growing into their own arms. They worked hard and without complaint and ate enough at the midday meal that Mara had to add to the pot twice, which she did without comment because feeding people who were working your land was the oldest arithmetic in the world, and she understood it. The north fence got rebuilt in 3 days. 6 sections that had been down since before Boone arrived, replaced with new posts and 3 rails of good timber from Orrin's delivery. Eli worked alongside the Greer boys and managed, by the end of the 3rd day, to be giving them advice about post setting, which they accepted without being condescending about it, because there was something in the boys' manner that made condescension feel inappropriate. Clara, for her part, had identified the elder Greer boy, whose name was Thomas, though everyone called him Tom, as a tolerable presence, which she communicated by bringing him a cup of water at her usual afternoon hour, and including him in the nod she gave Boone. Tom Greer accepted this with the serious gravity it deserved, which elevated him considerably in Clara's estimation. Well, the news about Mercer came from an unexpected direction. Percy, the banker's assistant, rode out to the Whitlock Ranch on a gray afternoon in the 3rd week of January. He was a slight young man on a horse too big for him, and he seemed to understand that he was not going to be the most welcome visitor these people had seen from the direction of Harrow Creek. He found Boone in the equipment barn and delivered his information with the straightforwardness of someone who'd decided honesty was the least complicated policy. Crane's been talking to the district bank examiner, Percy said, about the interest rate discrepancy. On several accounts, not just yours. He paused. I shouldn't be telling you this. Why are you? Boone said. Percy thought about it. Because I was the one who told my mother what you did, and then everybody knew. He looked uncomfortable. Seemed like I owed you something accurate in return. Boone looked at him for a moment. What's the examiner going to do? Investigate. I don't know more than that, but Mercer's not... He came into the office yesterday, and he and Crane were in there a long time with the door closed. When Mercer came out, he didn't look like himself. Percy paused. He looked smaller, like something he'd been planning for a long time had just... He searched for the word. Deflated. Boone absorbed this. The accounts besides the Whitlocks, he said. Other families? 4 others that I know about. Smaller situations, but same pattern. Boone was quiet for a moment. Those families know? Not yet. They should. Percy looked at him. I know, he said. I'm figuring out how. He rode back the way he'd come, still too large a horse, looking slightly more certain than he had on the way in. Mara took the news about the other families in silence, and then went outside and stood in the cold yard for about 10 minutes by herself. Boone left her to it. When she came back in, she said, I want to write to them. To who? The other families. The ones Crane overcharged. She went to the small desk in the corner of the front room, the desk where Daniel had done his planning, where his margin notes in tight, careful pencil had noticed the problem first. I want to let them know what's in their paperwork, that they have the right to question it. She sat down. I know what it's like to not know you have the right to question it. You'd need their names, Boone said. Percy can get them. Boone looked at her. She had her jaw set with the forward tilt it got when she'd made a decision, and the decision was finished being made. "You're going to need paper," he said. Daniel had paper. She opened the desk drawer and found it, and started writing. Boone went back to work and let her do the thing she'd decided to do, which was part of something larger shifting in her. A woman who'd spent 8 months turning inward to survive discovering that she could afford to turn outward again, that the ranch was stable enough now that she had something left over for the world beyond her gate. It was not a small thing. He understood that. It was the opposite of small. The money came from the most unexpected direction of all, which was a collective. 11 people showed up on a Saturday morning: Orrin, the Greer family in full, Eddie Marsh and his quiet business partner Sullivan, a ranching family named Dolores and Frank Reyes from south of Caldwell Crossing who'd heard the story through their own particular network, 2 women from the crossing who ran the dry goods store together and whose names were Harriet and June, and who arrived in a wagon with specific organizational energy, and Percy, who came without explaining why and helped unload things without being asked. They brought money, not a collection taken up from people who couldn't afford it. That wasn't what this was. They brought what they could honestly spare, and they put it on the kitchen table without ceremony or accounting. It wasn't a grand amount, it was enough. "For Cade and Rosie," Walt Greer said when Mara looked at it and started to object. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. "The children need to come home." Mara looked at Boone. Boone looked at the money on the table. He was a man who had built his life around independence, around the understanding that what he earned, and what he owed. He paid and what he needed. He worked for and didn't ask anyone for anything, because asking was a kind of vulnerability that the frontier punished without hesitation. He'd built walls around that understanding. Good, solid walls. He'd needed them. He looked at the money. He thought about Eli's jaw doing the thing it did. He thought about Clara and her nail tin. He thought about Mara writing letters at Daniel's desk in the cold morning. He thought about Cade, who had his mother's eyes and a conscience that worked too hard. Rosie, who had come out arguing. The walls were still there, but they had doors in them now that he didn't remember installing. "Thank you," he said. It came out rough, not polished, not the clean, grateful thing that the moment might have wanted, but it was real, and real was what these people dealt in. Walt Greer nodded once, the same way his wife had nodded that first day from the wagon seat. The matter settled. Outside, the January sky was high and pale, and the windmill was turning at a good steady pace, doing exactly what it was built to do. Frank Reyes said something in Spanish to his wife that made her laugh, and Harriet, from the dry goods store, was already in the kitchen asking Mara where she kept her biggest pot because she'd brought beans, and she intended to feed the people who'd come out in the cold. Orrin Fitch stood in the yard with Boone and looked at the new lean-to with professional satisfaction and said only, "Holds up," which was the highest praise his vocabulary permitted. Eli moved through the crowd of adults with the particular alertness of a boy taking inventory of the world, cataloging faces and voices, and the way these people talked to each other, which was the way people talked when they'd known real difficulty and come out the other side still willing to sit in the same room. He found Boone at the edge of the yard. "Are you going to get them?" he said. "Cade and Rosie, are you going to go?" Boone looked at the boy. "I'm going to write to Margaret first, make sure they're ready. How long will it take for them to get here?" "Couple months, maybe a little more." He paused. "Depends on the roads in spring." Eli considered this. "We could fix up the back room," he said. "It's not being used for anything. It needs replastering on the east wall, but that's not hard." "No," Boone agreed. "It's not hard." Eli looked at him with that 9-year-old directness that cut through the thing adults were not quite saying to the thing they meant. "They're going to live here," he said. Not a question. Boone didn't answer immediately. He looked at the house. He looked at the windmill turning, and the new fence line, and the repaired barn with the lean-to standing solid beside it, and the lamp in the kitchen window where Harriet was already loudly reorganizing Mara's pot situation. He thought about what he'd said to Mara back in the early days about wanting to build something worth coming back to. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but the back room could use some work either way." Eli nodded, satisfied with the honesty, if not entirely with the answer, and went inside to see about the beans. Boone stayed in the yard a moment longer. The afternoon light was going, the brief winter color starting in the west again. This time, he watched it a little longer before going inside. The letter to Margaret took Boone 3 attempts. The first one was too formal, stiff sentences that sounded like a man reporting to a superior rather than a brother-in-law writing to the woman who'd been raising his children for 2.5 years. He threw it in the stove. The second one went too far the other direction, trying to explain things that didn't need explaining and apologizing for things in a way that felt like it was more about making himself feel better than giving Margaret anything useful. He threw that one in the stove, too. The third one he wrote at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning before anyone else was awake, with coffee that had actually gotten strong enough to taste like something, and he wrote it the way he would have talked to her if she'd been sitting across from him, directly, without performance. He told her the children were going to have a home. He told her the details she needed, the ranch, the location, the situation, without overstating any of it. He told her what he could offer and what he couldn't, which was the only honest way to offer anything. He told her he was sorry it had taken this long and that he understood if she had questions and that he'd answer every one of them, but that he wanted Kate and Rosie to be on a wagon heading west before the spring mud made the roads difficult. He read it back once. Then he folded it, addressed it, and set it by the door where he'd remember to give it to the next person heading into Harrow Creek. Mara found it there an hour later when she came down. She looked at it without picking it up. She didn't say anything. She started the morning fire and put the pot on, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, which was a thing that had happened gradually enough that neither of them had noticed the exact moment it changed from the guarded kind. "The east wall of the back room," Boone said, from the table. She turned. "Eli said it needs replastering." She looked at him for a moment. "It does." "I'll start it today if you've got the material." She went to the stove and adjusted the damper and said, without turning around, "There's a bag of plaster mix under the workbench in the barn. Daniel bought it for a project he never got to." "All right." "Boone." "Yeah." She turned then, leaning back against the counter in the way she did when she was about to say something she'd been turning over for a while. "I want you to know something, before the children come, before everything changes again. I want you to know that what you did here for us is not something I'm not going to just move past it, like it was a transaction that's finished." She stopped, started again. "I'm not good at saying things like this." "I know," he said. "I'm serious." "I know you're serious. You're always serious." The corner of his mouth moved. "It's one of your more consistent qualities." She gave him a look that was trying not to be amused and not entirely succeeding. "What I'm trying to say is that this is your home too, if you want it to be." She said it plainly, no decoration, the way she said things that mattered. Not as charity, not as repayment for anything, just if you want it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside a bird called in the bare cottonwoods, same bird as before, or one like it. The frontier had its own absurdities, and they kept happening regardless of whatever else was going on. "I'm going to need to go back up the mountain," he said, "with Marsh on the Coldwater line. I can't be here every day." "I know that. I've been here 6 weeks, and I haven't done the one thing I actually came down to do, which is rebuild my resources. If I'm going to have children here, I need to be building, not just—" "Boone," she said his name with the particular weight she'd developed for it, the one that stopped the sentence going wherever it was retreating to. "I didn't ask you to be here every day. I asked if you wanted this to be home." He looked at her. She looked back. "Yeah," he said. "I want that. But—" She nodded once, matter-of-factly, and turned back to the stove. "Then eat something before you start on that plaster. You work worse when you haven't eaten and you don't notice." He didn't argue with that because it was true. Ochet. The district bank examiner arrived in Harrow Creek the first week of February and stayed for 11 days. His name was Garrett Hollis, and he was a thin, methodical man from the territorial capital who wore the same brown coat every day and carried a ledger book that he treated with more care than most people treated their children. He interviewed Crane twice on the first day, which was already a signal, and by the third day word had gotten around that he was pulling records going back 4 years. Mara's letters had reached 3 of the 4 affected families. 2 of them had written back within the week, and those letters, combined with Daniel's original loan documents with the penciled margin notes, had apparently been exactly the kind of paper trail that made a bank examiner's work both easier and more serious. Percy brought the news to the ranch in his usual manner, arriving on the too large horse looking slightly flushed with the significance of what he was carrying. Crane's cooperating, he told Boone in the yard. Hollis asked him to produce the rate justification documentation for 7 accounts, and Crane couldn't do it, because there isn't any. He paused. He's been talking about Mercer's involvement. Mercer's name is on paper somewhere? Boone said. Apparently he had a verbal arrangement with Crane, not written, because Mercer's not stupid, but Crane wrote memos to himself. Old habit. Hollis found them in the bottom drawer. Percy looked like he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about all of this. The mix of someone who'd been complicit by proximity with someone who was relieved the machinery was finally being examined. Mercer's hired a lawyer from the Capitol. 2 lawyers, actually. What does that tell you? That he's worried. Percy shifted on the horse. He came into the bank office yesterday afternoon, and I was the only one there. He walked past me like I didn't exist and went into Crane's office, and then discovered Crane wasn't there, and he stood in the middle of the office for a moment looking at the empty desk, and I have never seen a man look like that. He thought about it. Like something he'd built over a long time was being taken apart, and he had to just stand there and watch it happen. Boone considered this. The other families, he said, the ones Crane overcharged, will they get anything back? Hollis said probably. The process takes time, but the overcharges are documented now. Percy paused. Mrs. Whitlock's going to be included. She'll get back the difference between what she paid and what she actually owed. Boone nodded slowly. She doesn't need to know it came partly from her own letters, Percy added. Hollis doesn't care where the evidence came from, just that it holds up. She'll figure it out, Boone said. She's not slow. Percy almost smiled. No, she really isn't. He gathered his reins. I wanted you to know, that's all. I know why you came, Boone said. Thank you, Percy. The young man rode out looking slightly more comfortable than he'd looked the first time he'd ridden in with information. Time and honesty had a way of doing that to a person. The Mercer situation resolved the way these things resolved on the frontier, not with a dramatic reckoning, not with any single moment of public accounting, but with the slow deflation that Percy had described. The bank examiner's report went to the territorial authority. Crane's license was suspended pending review. 2 of the other affected families filed formal complaints. Mercer's land holdings weren't touched. He was too careful and too connected for that. But the particular scheme he'd been running through the bank was finished, and the leverage he'd been assembling over his neighbor's debts evaporated with it. He didn't come back to the Whitlock Ranch. He was seen twice in Harrow Creek through February, both times moving quickly, the big gray horse pushing a faster pace than usual. He did not stop to talk to people he would normally have stopped to talk to. He looked, according to Walt Greer, who mentioned it without satisfaction, like a man who'd realized the room was smaller than he thought, and the door was further away than he'd calculated. Boone did not feel triumphant about this. He noted it and moved on, because the work was still real, and the days were still short, and triumph was a feeling that didn't produce anything. He started on the Coldwater line with Eddie Marsh in the second week of February. They worked north for 4 days, setting the line, breaking trail through the late-season snow. Eddie was as good as his reputation, quiet, efficient, knowledgeable about the water and the terrain in the way that only came from years of paying attention to a specific piece of the world. He didn't talk much on the trail, which suited Boone. When he did talk, it was worth listening to. You know what the difference is, Eddie said one evening at the camp they'd made in a hollowed-out bank above the creek, between a man who traps well and a man who traps great? Patience, Boone said. Standard answer. That's part of it. The other part is knowing what you're doing it for. Eddie was working a small piece of carved wood with a knife, not making anything, just moving his hands the way old trappers did when they were thinking. Man who traps for money is always calculating, always comparing what he's getting to what he thinks he should be getting. That calculation is noise, gets in the way of reading the actual land. He paused. Man who traps for something specific, for a thing he can name. He's quieter inside, reads better. Boone looked at the fire. Your kids, Eddie said. Not a question. Yeah. How long since you've seen them? 2.5 years. Eddie was quiet for a moment. My daughter's kids call me Grandpa Ed. I didn't meet the youngest one until she was 8 months old because of how the winter roads work. He shaved a small curl off the wood. Every month I'm away from them costs something I don't get back. I know, Boone said. I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad, Eddie said. I'm telling you because it means something, doing what you did. The furs. Most men I know, they'd have told themselves the widow situation wasn't their problem. Plenty of ways to rationalize walking past a broken gate. I've walked past plenty of broken gates, Boone said. I know. Everybody has. Eddie folded the knife. That's what makes the times you don't walk past worth talking about. The fire burned low, and they let it. The cold came in from the creek, and they ignored it the way men did who'd slept in worse cold more times than they could count. March, Boone said. If Margaret makes good time on the roads. What? My children. They should be here by March, maybe early April if the weather delays them. Eddie looked at the fire. The cold water line should be producing well by then. Another 6 weeks of work, and you'll have a start on a new pack. He paused. Won't be 3 years' worth, but it'll be something. Something's where you start, Boone said. Eddie made a sound that was his version of agreement, and they went to sleep. Margaret's reply came the 3rd week of February. It was 4 pages, which was more than Boone had expected, and he read it twice at the kitchen table with Mara sitting across from him pretending to mend a shirt and very obviously not mending the shirt. Margaret was not angry. That was the first thing he registered, and the relief of it was more physical than he'd anticipated. Something that moved through his chest and left his shoulders different after than they'd been before. She was not angry. She was, in her careful and precise way, honest about the difficulty of the past 2.5 years, about the cost, financial and otherwise, of raising 2 additional children on her school teacher's salary, about the nights Cade had cried for his father in the first months, and the way Rosie had stopped talking for almost 3 weeks after they'd first arrived, and then one morning started again as if a switch had been thrown, about the 100 ordinary things that Margaret had done and continued to do without complaint, and without, and this was the word she used, without regret. She loved them. That was clear in every line, the way love showed up in practical people, not declared, just evident in the doing of things. She would bring them. She was firm about coming herself, not putting them on a freight wagon alone. She would need 2 weeks to arrange a substitute at the school and settle her affairs. She expected to depart in mid-March, which put her arrival at the ranch somewhere in the first week of April, weather allowing. She had questions, practical ones, precise ones, the kind of questions that told Boone she'd been thinking about this for longer than his letter had been in transit, thinking about it the way a woman thought about something she was already planning to do but needed the right moment to move on. She wanted to know about the ranch and the nearest doctor and the school situation for the children. She wanted to know about Mara because she was Margaret, and she paid attention to what wasn't said as much as what was. Boone read that part twice. He put the letter on the table. She's coming, he said. Mara set the shirt down. She looked at him, reading his face the way she'd learned to read it. She's bringing them herself. Yes. That's good. A pause. What does she ask about? At the end. How did you know she asks about something at the end? Because if I were her, I would. Boone looked at the letter. She asks about you. Mara was quiet for a moment. What does she ask? Who you are, he said, and whether it's a good situation. Another quiet moment. The stove ticked. Clara's voice came from the back room talking to her rag doll in the continuous and detailed narrative she'd recently developed for their interactions, which had become elaborate enough to constitute its own separate fictional world. What will you tell her? Mara said. Boone looked across the table. The truth. Which is? He thought about it for a moment, not because he didn't know, but because some things deserved the few seconds it took to make sure you were saying them right. That you're the most capable person I've met in 15 years on the frontier, he said. That your children are good because you made them good when you had nothing left to make things good with. That the ranch is solid and getting more solid. He paused. and that it's a good situation, the best I've had in a long time. Mara held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the shirt and went back to mending it, and this time she actually mended it. Oh, spring came the way it always came on the plains, not gradually, not gracefully, but in arguments. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. A week of mud followed by a hard freeze that made the mud worse. The cottonwoods along the creek put out the first tentative green in late March, and then lost half of it to a late frost that nobody was surprised by because this was the frontier and the frontier did not ease you into anything. But it came. Spring always came. Boone was back from the cold water line by the last week of March with enough new pelts to constitute a meaningful start. Not the 3-year collection he'd laid on Crane's desk, not yet, but enough to demonstrate to himself and anyone paying attention that what had been given away could be rebuilt. Eddie had been right about the line. The north section had produced better than its reputation, and Boone had worked it with the particular focus of a man who knew exactly what each pelt was for. The ranch looked different in the spring light than it had in January. Not transformed in the way that stories wanted things to be transformed. Not gleaming and reborn and suddenly a different place, but better. The way things looked when the work was real and the work had been done by people who intended to keep doing it. The barn roof sat solid and tight. The fence lines ran straight. The windmill turned in the April wind with all 4 blades, and the water trough never went dry. Eli had grown an inch, which Mara had noted on the doorframe in pencil the same way she'd noted it twice before, and he'd developed a habit of carrying a hand plane in his belt that he'd taken from his father's clean tools in the barn. He used it for no specific reason about half the time, and for a real purpose the other half, but either way he carried it, which Boone understood was about identity more than carpentry. The boy was figuring out who he was going to be. The tools were part of the figuring. Claire had started talking. Not suddenly. It was more like a creek that had been dammed up slowly unfreezing, more each day, until one morning it was just running the way a creek was supposed to run, and nobody made a big deal about it because making a big deal would have been the wrong thing. She talked mostly to Boone and to her mother and to her rag doll in roughly equal measure. She asked a lot of questions about animals, which led to Boone spending an improbable evening explaining the difference between how beavers and otters built their territories to a 6-year-old who listened with the intensity of someone taking notes. "Will Cade know about animals?" Claire asked toward the end of that conversation. "He knows some things," Boone said. "He's 7. "I can teach him about beavers," she said with complete seriousness. "He'd probably appreciate that." She nodded, satisfied, and went to bed. They arrived on a Wednesday in the first week of April. The wagon came up the trail road in the afternoon, the same road Mercer had come up in January with his papers and his threats and his careful pleasantness. The same road Walt Greer had come up with the food and the no-nonsense delivery. The road looked different in April, the mud dried to ruts, the grass coming up thin and new at the edges. Boone saw the wagon from the fence line where he was doing the last section of a repair job he'd been putting off. He set down the post maul and stood very still for a moment. Then he walked toward the gate. Cade was out of the wagon before it stopped. He was 7 years old, and he was not the 4-year-old that Boone carried in his memory. And the difference was significant in ways that were hard to look at directly. He was taller, obviously. But more than that, he was different in the face, more defined, a boy, rather than the soft-faced small child who'd waved goodbye from Margaret's porch 2.5 years ago without fully understanding what goodbye meant. He stopped about 10 feet from Boone. They looked at each other. Boone crouched down to be at his level. He was not going to grab the boy. He was going to let this happen at whatever pace it needed. "Hey, Cade," he said. Cade looked at him for a moment with those eyes that were his mother's eyes. Then he said, "You got a beard." "I have had a beard," Boone said, "since before you were born. It's longer. Mountains will do that." Another moment. Then Cade crossed the distance between them and put his arms around Boone's neck and held on with the specific fierceness of a child who had been practicing patience for 2.5 years and was done practicing now. Boone held on back. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that was better than just holding on. Rosie, on the wagon seat beside Margaret, watched this reunion with the critical eye of a 5-year-old who had her own opinions about how things were being handled. Then she apparently decided that waiting was not a reasonable option and climbed down off the wagon with complete confidence and no assistance and walked directly to where Boone was still crouched with his arms around Cade and inserted herself into the situation with the matter-of-fact entitlement of a youngest child who has never once doubted her own welcome. She smelled like wood smoke and road dust and something sweet that was probably whatever Margaret had packed for the journey. Boone closed his eyes. Just for a moment, just one moment where everything that had been moving for 3 years stopped. Margaret was a tall woman, spare and practical, with a face that looked like it had thought about a lot of things carefully. She shook Mara's hand in the yard with the directness of two women recognizing something in each other, and they talked for about 10 minutes near the house while the children went in every direction, and Boone stood with the particular uselessness of a man in the middle of a situation that was managing itself. Later, after supper, a real supper, Harriet from the dry goods store had sent word that she was going to arrive at 4 o'clock with provisions, and she did, treating the occasion with the organizational intensity she brought to everything, which nobody argued with. Boone found Margaret sitting on the porch steps alone, watching the last light leave the sky. He sat beside her. "She's good," Margaret said. She meant Mara. "Yes," he said. "The children seem settled here." She paused. "Eli." He explained to Cade the proper way to check a fence post for rot on the walk from the barn. Cade listened the entire time. "Eli'll be useful that way," Boone said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Rebecca would have been glad," she said carefully. His wife's name, spoken in Margaret's voice, which was closest to the source. He didn't say anything right away. "She would have said you took too long," Margaret added, and the edge of it was dry and fond in the way that only a sister could be. "She would have been right, but she'd have been glad." "I know," he said. They sat in the cooling evening and let the sounds of the house behind them. Children, voices, Clara explaining beavers to Rosie with the tone of a serious authority, Mara's laugh from somewhere inside, the first time Boone had heard her laugh without any reservation in it. Let all of that be what it was. "You're staying," Margaret said. Not a question. "I'm staying." She nodded once. She reached over and briefly put her hand over his, the way she would have done for a brother, which was what he was to her and had always been even through the hardest part of the hard years. Then she took her hand back and stood up. "Rosie's going to want a story before bed," she said. "She's very specific about the length." "How specific?" "At least 20 minutes, but not more than 30. She times it." He stood up. "At 5 years old." "She's always been like that," Margaret said, as if this were someone else's fault. He went inside. Eat. 2 weeks later, Margaret went back to her school and her life, with a promise from Boone that was not a vague promise, a specific one with a date about when they'd bring the children to visit her and what route they'd take. She accepted this with the same precision she'd given everything and hugged the children in a way that was careful and long, and then got in the wagon before any of it could become more than she wanted to manage in public. Cade watched the wagon go until it was out of sight. "She'll be back," Eli said, beside him. He said it not as comfort exactly, but as fact, which was more useful. "I know," Cade said. They stood there a moment. "Do you want to learn how to use a hand plane?" Eli said. Cade considered this. "What's a hand plane?" "Come on," Eli said. They went to the barn. "What, Mum?" By the time the grass was fully up in May, the Whitlock Ranch looked the way places looked when the people living on them had decided to stay. Not perfect. The equipment shed still needed a door that hung right, and the east pasture fence would need another pass before summer, and the root cellar was going to want new shelving before the fall harvest. There was always something. That was the nature of a working place. But the animals were healthy. The windmill turned. The children, 4 of them now, ranging in age from 5 to 9, establishing their own complicated social order with the efficiency and occasional ferocity of children who'd all had hard years and recognized something in each other because of it. The children were loud and present in the way that meant things were going the right direction. Rosie had, in the space of 3 weeks, transferred her considerable personality entirely to the Whitlock Ranch, as if it had always been the plan. She had identified the root cellar as a location of personal interest, Claire's bucket as a shared resource requiring negotiation, and Boone as her primary source of animal information, which she accessed by the simple method of following him until he answered whatever she was asking. Boone had not experienced being followed by Rosie since she was 2.5. The 5-year-old version was considerably more verbal and considerably harder to redirect. He didn't try very hard to redirect her. Cade found his footing more slowly, the way he did everything, feeling the edges first, learning the shape of the place before he committed to it. But by the 3rd week, he was working alongside Eli on the fence project without being asked. And by the 4th week, he and Eli had developed the particular shorthand of boys who've decided to be allies, which expressed itself mainly in the efficient division of tasks and the occasional absolutely inexplicable private joke that excluded all adults. Mara watched the children from the kitchen window one morning in late May, all 4 of them in the yard in the morning light, and she said to Boone, who was at the table with coffee, "I forgot what it sounded like." "What?" "A yard full of children," she said. "I forgot what it sounds like." He looked at her. She was not crying, she would probably not cry, but her face had the particular quality it had when something had reached somewhere she kept protected, and she was letting it reach there, which was different from the early weeks when she'd been keeping that place locked against everything, including the things that deserved to get in. "Good sound," he said. "Yeah," she said. "Good sound." She went back to what she was doing. He went back to his coffee. Outside the windmill turned in the May wind, steady and reliable, doing the job it had been built to do and repaired to do and would keep doing. Some things were as simple as that. You fixed what was broken. You showed up for what needed doing. You stayed when staying was the right thing, and you didn't make more of it than it was. But you didn't make less of it either. Boone Callahan had walked through a broken gate in January with an axe and a bedroll and 3 years of work rolled in oilcloth and no particular plan beyond one more thing to fix before he moved on. He had not moved on. He had not moved on, and the children in the yard were loud in the morning light, and the woman at the counter was humming something under her breath without seeming to know she was doing it, and the coffee was strong enough to taste like something. It wasn't a perfect life. It was going to keep being hard in the ways the frontier was hard. Weather and money and the work that never finished, and the losses that came when you weren't ready. There was no version of this story where any of that went away. But there was a version where you didn't face it alone. There was a version where a broken gate was an invitation instead of a warning. There was a version where the people who'd had the hardest years built the most durable thing, not because suffering made them noble, which it didn't, but because they learned through losing things what the things that couldn't be lost actually were. Boone set down his coffee and went outside to where the children were. He had fence work to do, and Rosie had 17 questions that weren't going to answer themselves. And somewhere in the barn, Eli and Cade were doing something with the hand plane that he probably needed to supervise before it went sideways. He went toward the sound of them. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.